If you weren't my wife's daughter, I would have done it long ago." I sat there, holding my cup of tea, frozen by what I had just heard. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could sense my fear. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, and in them I saw something I had never seen before, an intensity that both disturbed and intrigued me. I managed to whisper, "What did you just say?" trying to convince myself that it was nothing more than a passing thought. Instead of an explanation, he replied in a calm tone, "Forget about it," and turned away as if the subject was not worth discussing. His voice, steady and assured, only deepened the mystery of his words. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying his statement over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind those few words. Every minute that passed made the silence of my room feel heavier. I listened to the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the night, trying to understand what had just happened. Then, I heard it, the soft creak of the corridor door. My heart skipped a beat. I listened as slow, deliberate footsteps approached my door. When the door opened, I saw David standing in the faint light of the hallway. "Emily," he said softly, his voice almost pleading, "are you still thinking about it?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. I only stared, too overwhelmed to speak. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, he quietly left the room. In that brief encounter, I realized something had shifted between us. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet. My mother was still asleep, and my father was already gone, their routine, predictable and undisturbed. But inside me, something was different. I moved through my morning routine mechanically, yet my mind kept returning to David's words and his unexpected visit. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark liquid in my cup, trying to piece together what had happened the previous night. I kept asking myself, what did he mean by that? Why now? The questions kept me from focusing on anything else. I decided that I couldn't let the matter rest on vague suggestions. I needed to understand his intentions. I considered calling him, but I was afraid of what I might hear on the other end of the line. Instead, I resolved to wait for another opportunity to speak with him face to face. Later that day, while I was out running errands in town, I found my thoughts drifting back to our conversation. I recalled the steadiness in his tone when he said, "Forget about it," and the softness of his voice when he later asked if I was still thinking about it. It was as if he was trying to hide something behind his calm demeanor. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings were conflicted. I was both frightened and inexplicably drawn to him. There was a danger in his words that I could not ignore. Returning home, I tried to immerse myself in the tasks of the day. I cleaned, answered emails, and even attempted to relax with a book, but nothing could distract me from the memory of that conversation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face and heard his low, measured voice. I began to wonder if his words were a slip of the tongue or a deliberate confession. My mind was set on finding out the truth. That evening, after dinner when the house had quieted down, I decided to confront the issue. I found David in the living room, standing by the window. The light from the street outside cast a faint glow on his features, and I could see the tension in his posture. I took a deep breath and walked over to him. "David," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could, "I need to understand what you meant tonight. Your words, they changed everything for me." He paused and looked directly at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Finally, he replied, "Emily, there are things about me you don't know. Things I have kept hidden for a long time." I felt a surge of frustration. "I deserve to know what's real," I insisted. "You can't just dismiss it with, 'Forget about it.'" His eyes flickered briefly, and he hesitated before speaking again. "Some truths are complicated, Emily," he said quietly. "They aren't always meant to be spoken aloud." I pressed on. "That's not enough, David. Your words last night, your confession, have left me with more questions than answers. I need clarity." For a moment, the room was silent. Then he sighed and said, "I wish I could explain everything right now, but it's not that simple." His evasiveness only deepened my concern. I realized then that our relationship was on the brink of a change I wasn't sure I was ready for. After our brief conversation, David excused himself and left me alone in the living room. I sat there, trying to process everything. Every detail of our exchange replayed in my mind, the tone of his voice, the look in his eyes, and the way he seemed to waver between openness and withholding. I felt trapped between a need for truth and a fear of what that truth might reveal. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I spent the rest of the night in a state of restless anxiety. Every sound in the house made me jump, and I found it impossible to sleep. In the quiet hours before dawn, I reviewed every moment of our conversation in my head, trying to catch any hint of meaning that I might have missed. I began to see that David was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was distant and guarded. On the other, he showed moments of vulnerability that hinted at a deeper struggle within him. Despite my growing fear, I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him. I wondered if I was willing to risk my carefully controlled life for the sake of uncovering the truth about him, and about the connection that was forming between us. I knew that moving forward would not be easy, and that the answers I sought might come with consequences I was not prepared to face. As dawn approached and the first light crept through my window, I realized that the events of the past night had set us on an irreversible path. My mind was made up. I would seek the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. I knew that our lives were about to change, that nothing would ever be the same again. I took a final look around my room, now filled with the soft, early morning light, and gathered my resolve. I understood that the conversation with David was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex story. I felt a mix of apprehension and determination. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was both intimidating and, in a strange way, exciting. I was stepping into unknown territory where every moment promised new revelations and challenges. I closed my eyes and repeated the question in my mind. What does he really want? The answer was not clear, but I sensed that every interaction with him would bring me closer to understanding. I was no longer willing to let fear hold me back. I had to find out if the change in our dynamic was the start of something that could redefine my life. And as I sat there, processing the weight of the night's events and the unresolved tension between us, one thing was undeniable. But after that moment, I knew something had changed between us. The next day, I decided to leave the house. I needed a break from everything that had happened the night before. I met my friend Hannah at a small cafe nearby. The place was simple, and the aroma of fresh croissants filled the air. Despite the calm atmosphere, my thoughts kept drifting back to David. Hannah looked at me with concern as soon as we sat down. "You're a bit tense today. Are you all right?" she asked. I forced a smile and replied, "I'm fine. Just swamped at work." Even though I said that, every part of me wanted to share the truth about last night. I held back, knowing that opening up might complicate matters even further. For most of our time at the cafe, I tried to focus on the conversation about everyday things, work deadlines, plans for the weekend, and small talk about mutual friends. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't clear my mind of David's quiet apology and the strange way he had spoken to me the previous night. His words lingered, making it hard to enjoy even the simple comfort of a hot cup of coffee. After finishing my drink, I left the cafe and headed back home. The familiar route did little to calm my unsettled thoughts. I kept replaying every word and every glance exchanged with David, wondering what he really meant when he said, "It is not something I can control." I questioned whether his behavior was just an offhand remark or a sign of something more significant. When I finally arrived home, the atmosphere was as usual. My mother was in her room, working on her laptop, and the house seemed to be following its normal routine. I went into the kitchen to unpack the groceries I had bought. As I placed items on the counter, I heard a soft voice behind me. Before I had time to look up, David stepped forward. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," he said quietly. His tone was calm, and his words came out measured and sincere. I tried to avoid meeting his gaze and simply replied, "No need." Yet, I could feel his eyes on me, and it was hard not to notice the earnest look on his face. He continued, lowering his voice even further, "I just wanted you to know, it's not something I can control." The words came out almost as a whisper, and they struck me more sharply than I had expected. For a moment, I stood there silently, processing his apology and the confession that accompanied it. I felt a slight tremor in my hands as his words sank in. I had always thought of his issues as his own burdens, problems that didn't affect me. But something in his tone and in the way he looked at me made me question that assumption. I stepped away from the counter, needing a moment to clear my thoughts. As I left the kitchen, I realized that my feelings were no longer as clear-cut as they had been before. My mind raced with questions. What did he mean by not something I can control? Was there more to his behavior than just stress or personal trouble? I couldn't shake the impression that his inner struggles were beginning to affect me, drawing me into a situation I hadn't anticipated. At that moment, I knew I could no longer simply dismiss his words as an isolated incident. I had always prided myself on keeping a clear separation between his problems and my own life. However, His apology and the quiet admission that followed had unsettled that boundary. I recognized that something in him was starting to attract me in ways I had not expected. My hands trembled. I left the kitchen, but something inside had changed. I could no longer convince myself that it was only his problem. Something in him was beginning to draw me in. A few days later, I returned home from my evening training session later than usual. With my mother away on a business trip, I knew that David was the only one in the house. I planned to slip by quietly without drawing attention, but when I entered the living room, I found him already there. "How was training?" David asked, offering a casual smile as he looked up from the sofa. "Good," I replied briefly, my mind already set on reaching my room as quickly as possible. I avoided meeting his eyes, trying to ignore the tension that had built up over the past few days. David stood up slowly and followed me. "You're always running away from me, Emily," he said firmly. "I don't want you to be afraid of me." I stopped in my tracks and turned to face him. "I'm not afraid of you," I answered, my tone even but guarded. There were only a few steps between us. David moved closer, and before I could process my reaction, his hand slid onto my shoulder. The contact was simple, yet it carried a warmth that I felt deep inside. For a moment, I hesitated as I tried to reconcile this physical closeness with the uncertainty that had been growing between us. "We cannot deny it," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "This is more than just," he paused, as if weighing his words carefully, then continued, "more than just a casual connection." I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. His statement, delivered in such an understated manner, disrupted the routine of our everyday interactions. I stepped back abruptly, as if to put space between us, needing to catch my breath. I need a moment," I managed, my voice unsteady despite my effort to keep it controlled. Without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked briskly toward my room. Once inside, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. His words, and the unexpected closeness we had just shared, left me unsettled. I had convinced myself for a long time that nothing had changed between us, that our interactions were purely practical. But now, I could no longer ignore the evidence of my own reaction. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the conversation in my mind. The clarity of David's tone and the warmth of his touch lingered, refusing to let me return to the comfort of my usual detachment. I had told myself repeatedly that I felt nothing more than routine concern for him, but the truth was becoming harder to deny. I sat up and looked at the closed door, wondering if I should try to understand what had just happened. My thoughts kept circling back to his admission. "This is more than just." What did he mean? Had he finally admitted that his feelings were deeper than I had suspected, or was it simply an expression of frustration at our ongoing distance? The uncertainty left me restless. I remembered the days before when I had tried to distance myself from the tension between us, convincing myself that the awkwardness was temporary and nothing to worry about. But now, his words had disrupted that narrative. I realized that the dynamic between us was shifting in a way that neither of us could ignore. The next morning, I went about my usual routine with a sense of distraction. At work, I found it difficult to concentrate, and small details kept reminding me of the conversation from the night before. Every time I thought about David's quiet words and the unexpected intimacy of his touch, I felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. I wondered if I should confront these feelings head-on or continue to hide behind my usual reservations. That afternoon, while I was on a short break, I sent a quick text to David asking if we could talk later. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, but I felt the need to clarify what his actions meant for both of us. His reply came soon. "Sure, let's talk tonight." When I returned home that evening, the house was quiet again. My mother was still away, and the familiar silence of the house now carried a heavier significance. David was in the living room when I entered, sitting in a chair with a thoughtful expression. I could see that he had been waiting for me, perhaps expecting our conversation. "Let's sit down," he suggested in a calm voice as he motioned to the couch. I hesitated for a moment but then joined him, determined to get some answers. "I want to understand what happened tonight," I began. "Your words, and the way you touched me, it felt different. I need to know what you're trying to say." David looked at me steadily. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen so suddenly," he replied. "But I've been feeling things for a while now. I know I've kept my distance, and I know you've been trying to avoid any deeper discussion. The truth is, I feel something strong, and I can't ignore it anymore." I listened, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But what exactly do you mean? Is this about us?" Is it more than just our everyday interactions? He paused, then said, yes, it is about us. I know this might complicate things, and I don't expect an immediate answer from you. But I can no longer pretend that my feelings are insignificant. I just need you to be aware of what's happening. His words left me silent for a few moments. I thought about how our relationship had been for so long, defined by routine and practicality. Now, this new element was forcing us to reconsider everything. I wasn't entirely sure what I felt in return, but I knew that I could no longer claim indifference. After a long silence, I finally said, I need time to process this, David. I don't want to make any rash decisions, but I can't ignore that something has changed between us. He nodded slowly. I understand. I don't want to pressure you. I just needed to be honest about what I'm feeling. I left the conversation without a definitive conclusion, but the tension and uncertainty of that night lingered in my mind. I returned to my room, still grappling with the realization that I could no longer claim to feel nothing. David's words and actions had set something in motion, and I knew that from this point on, our relationship would never be the same. A week passed since that tense evening. I tried to avoid David as much as possible, but it became increasingly difficult. Every time I left the house, I expected to see his familiar presence in the hallways. It was clear that the unresolved tension between us was not going away on its own. One afternoon, my mother asked me and David to go together to the local farmer's market. It's good for you both to get out and spend some time together, she said. I knew the idea would be awkward, but I couldn't refuse. Reluctantly, I agreed, bracing myself for an uncomfortable day. At the market, the atmosphere was calm and practical. Vendors called out their specials while customers moved purposefully among the stalls. David was unusually attentive that day. We talked about everyday matters, comments on the weather, the quality of the produce, and small details about town events. Despite our mundane conversation, I could sense an undercurrent of tension between us that had grown stronger over the past few days. As we stood by a stall displaying fresh fruit, David suddenly spoke up. I've always known that you're special, he said quietly, his tone carrying more weight than our casual banter. But I didn't think it would be this hard. His words surprised me. I pretended not to hear him, but I couldn't shake the impact of his statement. Even in that simple moment, his confession left a mark. For the remainder of the market visit, David maintained a careful balance in his behavior. He was kind and considerate, yet every so often his eyes would meet mine with an intensity that made me question the nature of our relationship. I tried to focus on the task at hand, selecting fruits and vegetables, while my mind kept returning to his words. The day passed slowly, each moment marked by the silent acknowledgement of our shared discomfort. After the market, we returned home in a quiet, uneasy silence. I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through my thoughts. David's remark at the fruit stall and the way he had behaved throughout the day made it clear that our interactions were changing. I had long believed our relationship would remain strictly professional and detached. Yet now, it seemed that something deeper was emerging, something neither of us could ignore. That night, as I lay in bed trying to unwind, I was startled by a soft knock on my bedroom door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the late hour only heightened my surprise. I got up and opened the door to find David standing there, his expression earnest and a hint of desperation in his eyes. Emily, I can't hold this in any longer, he said quietly, his voice low and almost pleading. There was no pretense in his tone, only an honest urgency that made it clear he had been struggling with his feelings. Before I could process his words, he stepped into my room and sat at the edge of my bed. The physical space between us was minimal, just a few inches, but the proximity felt significant, loaded with the weight of unspoken emotions. You make me feel alive, David said, his words coming out softly. As he spoke, his hand moved toward me and brushed lightly against my arm. The simple contact was unexpected. It carried a warmth that made me pause, forcing me to acknowledge the growing closeness between us. I remained silent, simply watching him as I tried to understand what he was saying, and what it all meant for us. In that moment, I felt all my internal barriers begin to crumble. Despite my previous attempts to maintain distance, I could no longer ignore the effect his presence and words had on me. For several long minutes, we sat in silence. The quiet in the room was punctuated only by our breathing and the soft hum of the night outside. I considered everything that had happened over the past week, the farmer's market, his careful attentiveness, and his heartfelt confession at my door. It was clear that our relationship was shifting from a routine familiarity to something more complicated and personal. I finally broke the silence. I need time to process all of this, David, I said carefully. I can't pretend that nothing has changed, but I'm not sure what to do next. My voice was steady, yet I could sense the vulnerability in my own words. David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I understand, he replied. I don't want to pressure you, but I had to be honest about how I feel. I know it might be hard to accept, but I can't keep these feelings inside any longer. His admission left me with more questions than answers. I thought about our time at the market, how his words had struck me, even if I had tried to ignore them, and now this late-night conversation was forcing me to confront the possibility of a deeper connection. I realized that I could no longer claim that our interactions were insignificant or routine. The conversation ended without a clear resolution. We both understood that things between us had changed, but neither of us was ready to fully articulate what that meant for the future. I returned to my room, my mind buzzing with uncertainty and anticipation. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the day in my head. The market visit, David's careful but revealing behavior, and his late-night confession all pointed to a turning point. I acknowledged that the relationship we had maintained was now on the verge of transformation. While I wasn't entirely sure what the next steps would be, I knew that I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I closed my eyes, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the midst of this emotional upheaval. The steady rhythm of my breathing served as a reminder that I needed to be patient with myself and with David. It was clear that our next steps would require honest conversations and careful consideration. In that quiet moment, I accepted that our lives were no longer governed by the familiar routines of the past. David's presence had altered the dynamics between us, and the tension that had built up over the week was now palpable. I understood that this was just the beginning of a more complex chapter in our relationship, a chapter that promised both challenges and possibilities. As the night wore on, I lay awake, fully aware that nothing would ever be the same again. The internal barriers I had constructed were crumbling, and I was beginning to see that facing this new reality was inevitable. Despite the uncertainty, I was ready to take the next step, even if it meant embracing the complications that came with it. That evening, I was finally home alone. My mother had gone to visit a friend, and David had returned from work earlier than expected. I was sitting in my room, trying to relax after a long day, when I heard the door open without a knock. I turned around and saw David standing in the doorway with a serious look on his face. "I can't ignore this any longer," he said quietly as he stepped into the room and sat beside me on the edge of the bed. His tone was firm yet gentle, and I could tell he had been wrestling with his feelings for some time. Before I could say anything, David reached out and touched my cheek lightly. I felt a slight warmth from his hand that made my heart beat faster, and my breathing grew heavy as I tried to process what was happening. He leaned in closer, and for a moment, I thought this might be the turning point I had been dreading and secretly hoping for. "David," I began, but he quickly raised a finger to my lips, silencing me. He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he moved even closer, his face nearly touching mine as I felt his breath on my skin. In that charged moment, it seemed as if nothing else existed except the two of us. I felt every muscle in my body tense, caught between anticipation and uncertainty. Just as I was about to respond, a sharp knock came at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, and David immediately pulled back as if he had been startled. The knock sounded again, louder this time, and it was clear that someone was there. I realized with mounting dread that it was my mother. She must have returned earlier than expected. David's eyes widened, and he quickly stood up, stepping away from me. I felt a cold wave of anxiety as I looked toward the door. In a few seconds, the door opened and my mother stepped in. She paused in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on us. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, but the way her eyes lingered suggested she sensed something was off. "What is going on here?" she asked calmly, yet her tone carried an edge of suspicion. The question hung in the air, stark and unyielding. I stood there, frozen, not knowing how to explain the situation. David avoided her gaze, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to say something but wasn't sure what. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. My mother's calm inquiry contrasted sharply with the tension that had built between David and me over the past few weeks. My mind raced as I tried to think of a response. I had been trying to avoid any discussion of our growing closeness for some time now, but now everything had come crashing down in a single moment. I could see the hurt and uncertainty in David's expression, and I knew that his feelings, which he had tried so hard to hide, were now laid bare. "My dear, I expect honesty from you," my mother said softly, her eyes not leaving mine. Her voice was measured, but the disappointment was evident. I wanted to speak, to explain that the situation wasn't as clear-cut as it appeared, but the words failed me. David shifted uncomfortably and then spoke in a low voice. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I just couldn't keep my feelings hidden any longer." His words were simple and direct, lacking any embellishment, yet they carried the weight of all the weeks of tension and uncertainty. I could feel my pulse racing as I absorbed his confession. It was clear that both of us had reached a point where the boundaries we had maintained were no longer sufficient. The intimacy of our recent encounter and my mother's unexpected arrival created a scenario that neither of us had prepared for. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the night outside. I looked at my mother, then at David, and I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably, and I knew that whatever happened next, it would lead to further complications. I took a deep breath and managed to say, I need time to process all of this." My voice was steady, but inside I felt a mix of uncertainty and a strange sense of inevitability. David nodded slowly, his eyes conveying both understanding and regret. My mother's gaze softened slightly, yet the tension remained palpable. "I hope you both understand the seriousness of the situation," she said quietly. Her words were not harsh, but they underscored the fact that the delicate balance in our household had been disrupted. As my mother left the room, the silence that followed was heavy and final. I stood there, still processing the rapid turn of events. David's admission had set everything into motion, and now the repercussions were unavoidable. I knew that the relationship between David and me was entering a new, more complicated phase, one that would test our resolve and force us to confront truths we had long avoided. In that moment, I realized that while tonight's events had ruined the semblance of normalcy we once maintained, they also marked the beginning of something that could not be undone. Despite the tension and uncertainty, I understood that this was not the end, but rather the start of a challenging new chapter.